The morning hit Jack Turner, the way it always did, with the smell of cheap coffee, the sound of a cartoon on low volume, and the weight of everything he had to hold together before the sun was fully up. He moved through the small kitchen of their two-bedroom apartment like a man who had learned to be efficient out of necessity, not preference. Eggs cracked with one hand, toast pressed down, a juice box retrieved from the bottom shelf of the refrigerator without looking. Lily was still in her room, 10 years old, and doing what 10-year-olds do, taking forever to find one matching sock while somehow losing 5 minutes that didn't exist in the first place. He called her name once, gently, and heard the familiar scramble of footsteps that told him she was running late but not worried about it, because she trusted him to make sure everything turned out fine. That trust was the thing he worked hardest to deserve. She came bounding into the kitchen with her backpack half-zipped and her hair not quite brushed, and he fixed both without comment, setting her breakfast in front of her while he packed her lunch with the kind of practiced speed that spoke of years of doing it alone. He knew her preferences without having to ask. No mustard, extra apple slices, the blue water bottle, not the green one, and he moved through the small geometry of the kitchen with the fluid efficiency of a person who has learned that competence is its own form of love. There were no pictures on the refrigerator from a second parent, no coffee mug waiting for someone who slept in, no voice other than theirs filling the rooms of that apartment. It was just the two of them. And on most days, that felt like enough, though there were mornings, quiet mornings, when Lily said something particularly bright or funny or tender, when the ache of it all climbed into his chest and stayed there for a while. He didn't let it show. He kissed her on the top of her head, walked her to the bus stop 3 blocks away, watched her climb aboard with her lunchbox swinging, and then turned back toward the life he had made from what remained after everything else had fallen apart. The walk back to the apartment was always the loneliest part of the day. The 4 minutes between being needed and being invisible. And he moved through them, the same way he moved through everything else, steadily, without complaint, with his eyes open. His name badge read simply, Jack Turner. Facilities. At Titan Innovations, a company valued at several $billion and occupying 12 floors of glass and steel in the center of the city, that badge meant he was mostly invisible. He pushed a cart loaded with cleaning supplies through corridors, where men and women in tailored clothes walked fast and spoke loudly into phones, never glancing down at the man mopping the floor beside them. The executive suites on the 11th and 12th floors gleamed under his attention every single morning. The conference tables polished to mirror brightness, the carpets vacuumed in parallel lines that disappeared under the weight of 100 expensive shoes by 9 o'clock. He did his work without complaint and without ceremony, showing up before most people arrived and staying until the day's last mess had been addressed. His supervisor, a man named Gerald who managed facilities for the entire building, occasionally used Jack as an example of what a reliable employee looked like, not to compliment him, exactly, but to contrast him with staff who called in sick on Fridays. The distinction was purely functional. Gerald did not know Jack's last name until 6 months into his employment, and even then, only because HR sent a corrected timesheet. Among the junior associates, Jack was the man you smiled at in the elevator because it felt rude not to, but whose name slipped away the moment the doors opened. A few of the longer-tenured directors barely acknowledged him at all. And one, a senior vice president named Craig Donahue, had twice snapped at Jack for entering a room while a meeting was still in progress, once when the meeting had already been dismissed, once when Jack was simply replacing a burned-out light bulb that Donahue himself had complained about the previous afternoon. Jack absorbed these moments without visible reaction. It was a stillness people sometimes mistook for simplicity, and he had long since stopped correcting that impression. What lived behind his calm expression was more complicated. A man who had trained himself to observe rather than react, who had learned through considerable pain that speaking too quickly, trusting the wrong people, or believing that the right thing would automatically be rewarded, were all mistakes he could not afford to make twice. He watched everything. He remembered everything. He said very little. What puzzled the few colleagues who paid close enough attention was a quality they couldn't quite name: the way Jack sometimes paused near a workstation when someone left a spreadsheet open on their screen, not long enough to be intrusive, just long enough to register something. The way he could glance at a printed financial summary left on a conference table and, days later, mention offhandedly to a facilities colleague that one of the line items seemed misaligned with the quarterly numbers from the previous report. Nobody took these observations seriously, of course. He was the janitor, but the observations were always correct, and somewhere beneath the fluorescent lights of the 12th floor executive suite, behind a cart loaded with cleaning solution and microfiber cloths, Jack Turner understood the financial structure of Titan Innovations better than half the people whose offices he cleaned each morning. He had spent years carrying that knowledge the way he carried everything else, quietly, carefully, and completely alone. The assignment came down through Gerald without explanation, as most assignments did. The executive conference room on the 12th floor needed to be fully prepared by 7:30 in the morning for a strategic leadership summit that would run through most of the day. Emma Collins, the CEO, a name that carried its own specific gravity, even in the break rooms and loading docks where Jack spent most of his time, would be present, along with the full senior leadership team, several board representatives, and at least 2 external consultants. It was the kind of meeting that made people on every floor of the building walk a little straighter. Jack showed up at 6:15 with his cart and went to work. The room was large, built for theater as much as function, with a long oval table of dark wood, high-backed chairs in charcoal fabric, and a wall of windows that caught the early light and turned it gold across the floor. He cleaned the glass, straightened the chairs, adjusted the angle of the projection screen, and wiped down each place setting with the specific attention to detail that his work required. He was almost finished when Margaret, the senior executive assistant who managed the CEO's schedule and most of the floor's logistics, came in with a rolling tray of coffee service individual porcelain cups, a set of small carafes, and a tray of pastries arranged with the kind of care that signaled this was not a routine meeting. She set up the service near the credenza at the far end of the room, exchanged a brief, polite nod with Jack, and left to handle the dozen other things demanding her attention before the room filled. Jack continued working from the opposite end of the table, wiping down the last few surfaces and collecting the small pile of forgotten items: a pen cap, a sticky note with nothing written on it, a single cufflink that had been lying under the credenza for at least 3 days. He was moving toward the door when something made him stop. It was not a loud signal. It was the kind of thing that registers below conscious thought first, a small wrongness that takes a moment to climb to the surface of awareness. He turned back toward the coffee service and looked more carefully. The cups were identical, which was correct. The carafes were arranged in the usual order, which was also correct. But one cup near the head of the table, the position reserved for the CEO, as evidenced by the leather-bound agenda placed just above the setting, was not quite right. The coffee in it was slightly darker than the others, though the difference was subtle enough that most people would dismiss it without a second thought. There was something else, a faint smell that didn't belong, layered beneath the rich, familiar scent of fresh coffee, like a word in a sentence that doesn't fit the meaning of the rest. And at the bottom of the cup, just barely visible through the dark liquid, a residue that settled differently than ordinary grounds. Jack stood completely still and looked at that cup for 4 long seconds. Then he stepped back, positioned his cart near the doorway, and waited. They arrived in waves: associates first, then directors, then the senior leadership team, filing in with the particular authority of people who expected rooms to rearrange themselves for their benefit. Craig Donahue entered without glancing at Jack and took the seat 2 places from the head of the table. The board representatives came in together, speaking in low voices. The external consultants set up near the window. And then, with the kind of quiet momentum that preceded something significant, Emma Collins walked through the door. She was 42 years old, compact and deliberate in her movements, with the quality of attention that made people feel both seen and assessed simultaneously. She had built Titan Innovations from a mid-sized software firm into a company that appeared on lists that mattered, and she carried that history with a composure that was neither arrogant nor effortless. It was earned, and it showed. She moved to the head of the table, set down her portfolio, exchanged brief words with the consultants, and reached for the coffee cup that had been placed at her seat. Her fingers had just closed around the handle when Jack spoke from the doorway clearly, loudly, with the kind of certainty that doesn't invite negotiation. "Don't drink that coffee." The room went absolutely still. 12 faces turned toward the man with the cleaning cart, standing at the edge of the room. Emma Collins lowered the cup back to its saucer without drinking, and looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, not angry, not dismissive, but genuinely evaluating. The silence lasted only a few seconds before Craig Donahue's voice cut through it, cold and flat. "What did you just say?" The quiet in the conference room after Jack spoke was a specific kind of quiet, the kind that forms when something unexpected has happened, and no one yet knows how to categorize it. Jack did not flinch under the weight of 12 sets of eyes. He held his position near the doorway, hands resting on the handle of his cart, and said it again clearly, without apology. "The coffee in that cup. Don't drink it." Donahue was on his feet almost immediately, his chair scraping back against the hardwood, with a sound that made two people at the far end of the table visibly tense. His voice carried the particular authority of someone who had spent 20 years using volume as a management tool. He wanted Jack removed from the floor, removed from the building. And he wanted it done before the meeting went any further. Two of the other directors nodded along with the kind of reflexive agreement that comes from sitting close to power for too long. Emma Collins did not raise her voice. She said one word, "Wait," and the room obeyed. She looked at the cup on the table in front of her, then at Jack, and then she asked a single question. Why? It was not a challenge. It was the question of someone who had learned that the best decisions begin with information rather than assumption. Jack told her what he had seen. The color difference, the smell, the residue. He described it simply and precisely, the way a person describes facts when they are confident in what they observed. Several people at the table exchanged glances that fell somewhere between skepticism and unease. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, she reached for her phone and called building security. The cup was bagged and tagged within 10 minutes. A rapid analysis was requested through the company's on-site medical team, a benefit of operating a large enough facility to have one, and a sample was additionally sent to an external laboratory for independent confirmation. While they waited, the meeting was suspended. People gathered in small clusters near the windows or checked their phones without really looking at them. Donahue stood near the credenza with his arms crossed, speaking in a low, irritated voice to a colleague who nodded without responding. Jack remained in the hallway, where a junior security officer had politely suggested he wait. He waited. He had been waiting patiently for years. A few more minutes was nothing. The initial results came back within 40 minutes. The security team leader entered the conference room, conferred briefly with Emma, and then the room received the information in stages. First, the medical officer's verbal assessment, then the confirmation from the preliminary analysis. What had been placed in Emma Collins's coffee was a compound that should not have been there by any accident. In sufficient concentration, it would have triggered a serious physiological response, not lethal, the medical officer was careful to say, but severe enough to cause significant harm and almost certainly require hospitalization. Someone had put it there deliberately. The room received this information with a silence that was entirely different from the one that had followed Jack's warning. This silence had weight. It had fear in it. The people who had been loudest in their mockery of Jack Turner 3 minutes earlier were now standing in that silence and looking at their own coffee cups with sudden and acute attention. Donahue, who had been prepared to have Jack escorted from the building for overstepping his place, was very quiet and very still. Someone near the window said nothing for so long that the person beside them eventually touched their arm just to confirm they were still present. Emma Collins stood at the head of the now empty table and looked at the ceramic cup sitting in its evidence bag, and her expression had shifted into something that those who worked closest to her recognized as the particular focus she brought to problems that were not going to be solved quickly or cleanly. She told the security team to pull every camera feed from the 12th floor going back to the previous afternoon. She told the building manager to secure the coffee service area, and she told the assembled executives that the strategic summit was postponed indefinitely, effective immediately. Before anyone left the room, she walked to the hallway where Jack Turner was still waiting, looked at him steadily, and said, "Thank you." 2 words, delivered with the directness of someone who meant them completely. Jack nodded once. He meant the nod completely too. The camera footage review began within the hour and produced its first uncomfortable finding before noon. The feeds from the coffee service corridor, a narrow passage connecting the executive kitchen to the main conference level, showed a gap of 11 minutes beginning at 5:47 in the morning, during which the recording simply stopped. Not corrupted, not degraded. Stopped. When it resumed at 5:58, the corridor was empty, and everything looked exactly as it should. The gap was too precise, too clean, to be a technical malfunction. Someone had known how to access the recording system and had done so with enough advanced knowledge to time the interruption correctly. Emma's head of security, a methodical woman named Patricia Hale who had previously worked in corporate investigations, noted that this kind of targeted editing required either administrative access credentials or a considerable level of inside knowledge about the surveillance infrastructure. Further review revealed that the editing software's access log had itself been cleared, which required a second level of credential access, and that 2 other camera segments from different dates in the previous 6 weeks showed similar brief, precise gaps, all centered on either the executive floors or the server room corridor on the 9th floor. Patricia flagged each instance and cross-referenced the timestamps against the building's access card records, looking for patterns. She found several. She brought them to Emma in a meeting that lasted 90 minutes and ended with both women sitting in a particular kind of thoughtful silence that meant the scope of what they were looking at had just expanded considerably. Through all of this, Jack Turner returned to his regular duties. He cleaned the suspended conference room, replaced the coffee service equipment per the security team's request, and continued his afternoon rounds with the same undramatic efficiency that characterized every other day of his work at Titan Innovations. A handful of colleagues approached him with questions or expressions of disbelief, and he responded to all of them with the same measured calm. He had noticed something. He had said something. The rest was up to the people whose job it was to handle it. But Emma Collins, working through Patricia and through her personal assistant, arranged a private meeting with Jack that afternoon. She wanted to understand not just what he had seen that morning, but how he had seen it. What he knew. What he was. They met in a small conference room on the 10th floor, one that was not typically used by senior leadership. Emma arrived first and poured her own water from a pitcher on the table, which Jack noted without comment. He sat across from her and answered her questions directly. When she asked why he hadn't reported the anomaly through a different channel through security, through his supervisor, through an anonymous tip line, he told her that there hadn't been time and that in his experience, channels had a way of closing before information completed its journey through them. She asked what he meant by that, and he paused, and then he told her something that reoriented the entire conversation. He told her that he had worked in data analytics before he worked in facilities, not as a junior assistant or a support technician, as a senior analyst, in a role that required him to model complex financial data, identify inconsistencies across large transaction sets, and produce reports that directly informed executive decision-making. Emma Collins looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked which company, and when he told her when he said the name Titan Innovations, the meeting changed into something else entirely. 7 years was a long time to carry a story. But Jack Turner had carried it with the particular discipline of someone who understood that releasing it prematurely, to the wrong person, in the wrong context, would cause it to disappear the same way it had disappeared before. He told Emma Collins the truth, because the morning had created an opening he had not expected, and because he had spent 7 years waiting for a version of this conversation without ever quite believing it would come. He had joined Titan Innovations as a data analyst 9 years ago, when the company was smaller and the culture was less structured. He was 29 years old and considered promising the kind of employee whose work got flagged in performance reviews as exceeding expectations, whose name circulated in conversations about succession planning and departmental leadership. He was good at his job in the specific way that creates problems. He was thorough. He noticed things that less careful analysts let slide because they were inconvenient to explain or required more investigation than the quarterly timeline allowed. In the second year of his employment, he began noticing discrepancies in the revenue data flowing through the analytics platform, small initially, the kind that could plausibly be attributed to accounting timing differences or rounding across subsidiaries. He documented them and included a note in his quarterly summary, flagging them for review. The note was acknowledged. Nothing happened. Over the following 6 months, the discrepancies grew. Not dramatically, whoever was managing them was careful, but in ways that compounded across quarters, in ways that a patient analyst could eventually map. Jack built a model. The model showed money moving in patterns that didn't correspond to legitimate business activity. Funds routed through intermediate accounts, vendors that appeared in the payment system, but had no corresponding contracts or deliverables, adjustments made to data that had already been finalized and signed off. He went to his direct manager. His manager told him the numbers had been reviewed and were accurate. Jack asked to see the review. He was told it was above his clearance level. He wrote a formal memo and submitted it through the internal compliance system. 2 days later, the compliance portal showed no record of his submission. He had saved a copy. He printed 3. He brought those copies to a senior director named Michael Reed, who was at that time the chief financial officer and who had a reputation accurate, Jack had always believed, for genuine integrity. Michael received the documents, asked careful questions, and told Jack that he would take it seriously and investigate through the appropriate channels while keeping Jack's identity protected. Jack believed him. He went home that night to his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Lily, who was 3 years old. And he felt for the first time in months that the information he was carrying might actually land somewhere that could hold its weight. What happened next dismantled everything. Within 3 weeks, Jack's employment was terminated under a vague set of reasons related to performance and conduct allegations, so disconnected from his actual record that he spent days rereading his own reviews, trying to find the thread that might have pulled to build the case against him. His access was revoked before the termination meeting concluded. A colleague he had trusted with a fragment of the story stopped returning his messages the same day. The printed copies he had kept at home were his only remaining evidence of what he had found. And in the months that followed, as he navigated the collapse of his professional life, something far more devastating consumed all of his attention. Sarah was diagnosed with an aggressive illness that took her from him and from Lily within 14 months of his termination. The grief of it was total and consuming. And the injustice of what had happened at Titan receded into a part of him that he simply locked and walked away from because survival required it. He had not walked away from it entirely, though. He had spent the years that followed doing what was necessary, learning to be the parent Lily needed, finding stable employment, rebuilding something that resembled a life. When the facilities position at Titan had opened 4 years ago, the decision to apply had not been impulsive. He had thought about it carefully. In the way he thought about most things, he took the job because it put him back inside the building where the story had begun, with access to floors and rooms and pieces of information that no one would think to hide from the man cleaning the conference table. He was patient. He was watching. He was waiting for the moment when what he knew would matter to someone with the power to do something with it. He had not expected that moment to arrive the way it did over a cup of poisoned coffee. In a room full of people who barely knew his name, Emma Collins listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for nearly a minute. Then she asked him one question. "Do you still have the copies?" He did. What Emma assembled in the following days was constructed with the care and deliberate architecture of someone who had run a large organization long enough to understand exactly which levers to pull and which to leave alone. She could not use the company's existing internal audit infrastructure. The morning's events had made clear that the infection, wherever it originated, had roots deep enough to have survived 7 years and sophisticated enough to target her directly. She reached instead into a network of professional relationships she had cultivated carefully over a decade of industry leadership, and from that network she extracted 3 people: a forensic accountant with a federal investigative background, a cybersecurity analyst who had previously worked on financial fraud cases, and a former regulatory compliance officer with specific expertise in the kind of layered transaction structures Jack had first identified 9 years ago. She brought them in under the cover of a routine external review, the kind that a board periodically requested, and that no one in senior leadership would find unusual enough to investigate. They worked for 8 days in a secure room on the 7th floor, with full access to financial records going back 10 years, and what they found in those records confirmed what Jack had mapped and Michael Reed had died professionally trying to report. The scale was larger than either of them had known. Over the course of 7 years, more than $20 million had been systematically moved through a network of fictitious vendor accounts, intercompany transfers that had no underlying business rationale, and expense classifications that obscured the true nature of the outflows. The operation had required consistent access to both the financial data systems and the compliance reporting infrastructure, two separate systems that, in theory, required separate authorization, which meant it had required cooperation from multiple people with distinct, elevated access levels. The forensic accountant, whose name was David Wren, estimated that at its peak, the operation had involved at least 4 active participants, all of them positioned within the senior leadership structure of the company. Jack contributed to the investigation in ways that the external team found quietly remarkable. He sat with David and the compliance specialist during their evening sessions after his regular shift ended, quietly knocking on the 7th floor door and settling in with the documents, and he walked them through the specific transaction patterns he had identified 9 years ago, matching them against current data with a precision that compressed what might have been weeks of analysis into days. He remembered not just the general shape of the discrepancies but specific account reference numbers, processing timestamps, the names of vendors that had appeared in payment records for a single quarter before disappearing. The cybersecurity analyst, a woman named Renata who had seen hundreds of financial fraud cases, told David on the 4th night that she had never worked a case where a witness had this kind of detailed longitudinal memory. David told her Jack hadn't been a witness. He had been the first person to find it, and he had been carrying it alone for 7 years. The most significant gap in the investigative picture was the period immediately preceding Jack's original termination, the window during which Michael Reed had supposedly been investigated for the same conduct that Jack had, actually, reported. The forensic team had found evidence of document manipulation from that period, but the manipulated files were largely incomplete, their content degraded by whatever process had been used to alter them. What they needed were the originals or, at minimum, a parallel set of records that predated the alterations and could demonstrate what the data had looked like before someone had changed it. Emma made the decision to contact Michael Reed herself. She had Patricia Hale locate him through public records, a process that took less than an hour but produced information that landed quietly and heavily in Emma's chest. Michael Reed, who had been the chief financial officer of a major technology corporation, who had held an advanced degree from one of the most respected business schools in the country, and had been considered a serious candidate for CEO-level positions at multiple firms, was currently working as a part-time bookkeeper for a small hardware distribution company 2 states away. He lived in a modest apartment. He had not worked in a senior financial role since his termination from Titan Innovations 7 years ago. The reputational damage from his firing, which had been accompanied by internal communications characterizing him as having engaged in financial misconduct, had followed him with the quiet, persistent efficiency of something designed to follow. Emma drove to see him herself, without Patricia, without security, without any member of the leadership team. She wanted to give him the choice of how this conversation began and ended. Michael Reed answered the door of his apartment in the late afternoon, and he looked at her with the careful, measured expression of a man who had trained himself to expect very little from the people who had once occupied the corridors of his professional life. She told him why she was there. He listened without moving. When she finished, he turned and went into the apartment, returned with a cardboard box he retrieved from a closet, and set it on the kitchen table between them. The box contained the originals. He had kept everything. Email chains from the period of the internal investigation that had been launched against him, emails in which the language shifted, in which questions became accusations without any intervening evidence, in which his own words were selectively quoted in ways that stripped their context entirely. Records of vendor transactions that he had flagged and requested explanations for, with the responses he had received that, read now against the full investigative picture, revealed themselves clearly as deliberate misdirection. A printed copy of a letter he had written to the board audit committee, a letter he had sent certified mail, with delivery confirmation, which the audit committee's records showed was never received, and a backup drive containing his personal copies of the financial analyses he had prepared in the weeks before his termination, analyses that matched with precise and devastating accuracy the pattern that Jack Turner had independently identified and documented from the other side of the same data. David Wren's team spent 14 hours with Michael's materials. When they surfaced at the end of those 14 hours, Renata had the specific expression of someone who had found exactly what she needed and was still recalibrating the implications of what it meant. The evidence, taken in full, told a coherent and damning story. A group of senior leaders within Titan Innovations had been running a long-term financial extraction scheme, had discovered 2 employees who were close to exposing it, and had responded by destroying both of them, one through manufactured misconduct allegations, one through a termination built on fabricated performance failures. The poisoning attempt on Emma Collins, the investigative team concluded, was almost certainly connected. As the investigation's paper trail began to surface through the external review, someone within the group had recognized the threat and moved to eliminate the person most likely to bring them down. The names that emerged from the evidence were specific and, in several cases, familiar to Emma in ways that required her to sit with the information for a longer time than she wanted to. Craig Donahue was among them, the man who had most loudly demanded Jack Turner be removed from the building the morning of the attempted poisoning. 2 other senior vice presidents, a director in financial operations, a former compliance officer who had left the company 3 years earlier, but whose involvement in the scheme's architecture was embedded in the earliest records of the operation. The network was exactly the kind that could survive for 7 years in a large organization distributed enough that no single point of failure would expose it, senior enough that anyone who noticed anomalies would be dismissed or neutralized before they could act on what they found. When Emma called the emergency board meeting, she did not send an agenda in advance. She requested the presence of every board member physically capable of attending within 48 hours, and the specificity of the request, combined with what had already been communicated about the postponed summit and the security incident, produced 100% attendance. The board convened in the main conference room on the 12th floor, the same room where the coffee cup had sat at the head of the table 6 days earlier. Emma entered with David Wren and Renata on one side, and Patricia Hale on the other, carrying a physical evidence folder and a presentation that had been built with the precision of a legal brief. She presented for 90 minutes. She did not editorializing. She laid out the timeline, the financial data, the documentary evidence, the camera footage, the access records, the connection between the current poisoning attempt and the 7-year-old scheme, and she did it in the exact order in which the evidence had been found and verified. The 4 individuals named in the investigation were seated in the room and were informed of the accusations at the beginning of the presentation rather than the end, a deliberate choice on Emma's part that removed the possibility of preemptive narrative control. Donahue denied everything immediately, and with enough volume to suggest he still believed authority was a function of confidence. The others handled it differently. One sat very still, one began to cry, one asked for a lawyer within the first 20 minutes, which was noted in the official record of the meeting. The forensic accountant confirmed his findings independently when the board's own counsel requested a summary. The board counsel, a woman named Harris, who had seen a great deal of corporate litigation in 30 years of practice, reviewed the materials and told the board chair that the evidentiary foundation was among the most complete she had encountered in a corporate fraud case. The board voted within the hour. All 4 named individuals were suspended immediately pending termination procedures. The full materials were to be transmitted to the appropriate regulatory and law enforcement agencies. An independent auditor was to be retained to conduct a full review of the company's financial records going back to the inception of the scheme, and the board formally resolved to review all personnel decisions made during the relevant period, with particular attention to any employee whose departure might have been connected to the fraud. That last resolution was the one that mattered most to a man who did not hear about it until several days later. Michael Reed received a phone call from Emma Collins on a Tuesday morning. She called him herself, again, rather than routing it through legal or HR, and told him what the board had decided and what it meant for him specifically. His termination had been found to have been made in bad faith and on the basis of manufactured evidence. His professional record at Titan Innovations would be corrected. A formal statement clearing his name would be issued through appropriate professional channels, and the company would make him whole for the financial damages his wrongful termination had caused, through a settlement that took into account the career he had been prevented from having. The statement that would accompany the settlement was not a quiet, hedged corporate document. It named what had happened to him in clear language, placed the responsibility with the people who bore it, and established on the public record that Michael Reed had done precisely what an ethical financial officer should do and had been punished for it by people who understood that the most dangerous thing in their world was an honest man in a position of authority. Michael Reed, who had built a wall of careful, necessary composure over 7 years of carrying an injustice he couldn't disprove, listened to Emma's voice and said nothing for a very long moment. Then he said, quietly, that he had stopped expecting this. She told him she understood why. She told him she was sorry it had taken this long, and she meant it in the specific way of someone who has had to reckon with the fact that things happened on her watch that she hadn't known about, which was its own particular kind of accountability. The company meeting was Emma's idea, and she was specific about the format. It would not be a press release, not a memo, not a cascading email chain summarizing events. Every employee of Titan Innovations who was physically present in the building would gather in the main atrium on the ground floor. Remote employees would be connected by live video. Emma had thought carefully about what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it, and she had written the first draft and then set it aside and written another one, because the first draft sounded like a corporate communication, and this was not a corporate communication. This was something else. The atrium held 300 people standing, and it was full. Emma stepped to the small raised platform at the center of the room without notes, without a teleprompter, without the kind of formal apparatus that turns speaking into performance. She stood in front of the company she had built, and she told them the full story, not the version that could be released publicly, not the version optimized for media, but the actual story, from the morning of the coffee cup, to the board meeting, to the moment when she had understood that the entire chain of events stretched back 7 years to a data analyst who had found the truth and been destroyed for it. She told them what had been done. She told them who had done it. She told them what accountability looked like. And then she paused and told them that she had asked one specific person to be in the room today because the company owed him something it could not fully repay but was going to attempt anyway. Jack Turner was standing near the back of the atrium when Emma said his name, because he had arrived the way he always arrived, quietly, without announcement, positioned where he could see everything without drawing attention. He had not known exactly what to expect from the meeting. And when Emma's eyes found him in the crowd, and she asked him to come forward, he moved through the parting crowd with the calm, unhurried quality that was simply who he was. He stepped up onto the platform beside her, and the room, 300 people who ranged from executives he had cleaned offices for, to colleagues who had worked beside him for 4 years without knowing his history, rose to their feet without any prompting, and the sound of it filled the atrium, and climbed the walls, and reached the upper floors where it had no words but required none. Emma told the company who Jack Turner actually was. She read from the performance evaluations that had been buried in the old filing system. Brilliant, she said, and methodical, and possessed of the kind of analytical precision that only comes from someone who genuinely cares about getting things right. She told them what he had been before, and what he had walked away from, and what he had returned to do, and that the morning when he had stopped her from drinking that cup of coffee was not a coincidence or an accident, but the culmination of years of patience and integrity that most people in this room, herself included, could not claim to fully understand. She told them that the value of a person is not determined by the title on their badge or the floor they're permitted to access, and that the person who had changed the course of this company's history had been pushing a cleaning cart through their hallways for 4 years while they looked right through him. She said this without softening it, because she believed they all needed to hear it without softening. Then she turned to Jack and told him directly, not to the room, but to him, that Titan Innovations would like to offer him a position as a senior data analytics specialist, with immediate effect and at a compensation level reflecting the experience and expertise he had maintained through all the years they hadn't been paying him for it. She told him the position was his to accept or decline, and that either answer would be respected completely. The room was still when she said it, the particular stillness of 300 people collectively holding a breath. Jack looked at Emma Collins for a moment. Then he looked out at the room at the faces of people he had served and been overlooked by. At the junior analysts who had been hired into the role he should never have left, at the security officer who had asked him to wait in the hallway 6 days ago, and now stood with an expression of specific and genuine regret. He thought of Lily. He thought of Sarah, who had believed in him before he had found it fully necessary to believe in himself. He thought of Michael Reed, who was somewhere 2 states away, learning that the 7 years of exile had not been the final word on his story. He thought of the particular quality of mornings when he woke up carrying the weight of a truth nobody wanted to hear, and the different quality of this morning, when that weight had finally found its proper destination. He accepted the offer. He said yes in one word, simply, and the room came back to life around him. And for the first time in a very long time, something in Jack Turner's chest released. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of what had happened at Titan Innovations worked their way through the systems designed to handle them. The regulatory filings were submitted. The law enforcement referrals were processed. Craig Donahue and the others engaged legal counsel and mounted the defenses that people in their position inevitably mounted, but the evidence assembled by David Wren's team was of the kind that buries those defenses slowly and completely. The independent audit confirmed the full scope of the fraud and added additional findings that the forensic team had flagged as worth pursuing. The company's stock recovered from the initial volatility that the public announcement had caused, steadied by the board's decisive response and by the widely covered story of what had actually happened. A story in which Emma Collins gave credit with the same directness she brought to everything else, and in which Jack Turner's name appeared in a context entirely different from the one it had occupied for the past 4 years. Michael Reed relocated closer to the city. He took his time deciding what came next, a deliberate pace that he had earned, and when he eventually returned to consulting work, he brought with him not only the technical expertise that had never left him, but the particular credibility of someone who had been tested in ways that most professionals never face and had come through it with their character intact. He and Jack had dinner together 3 times in the months following the board meeting, conversations that began with the obvious shared history and moved into the territory of people who understand each other in the way that only shared experience of specific injustice can create. And on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, Jack Turner drove his daughter to school for the first time in years, without the familiar weight of needing to be somewhere that didn't see him. He was wearing different clothes, not the gray uniform of the facilities department, but the ordinary clothes of a person going to an ordinary job that matched what he actually was. Lily sat in the passenger seat with her backpack and her lunchbox, and the completely unself-conscious confidence of a child who has always believed her father was exactly who she needed him to be, and who had been quietly and absolutely right about that from the beginning. She had asked him, the evening after the company meeting, whether things were going to be different now. He had thought about that question for a moment, genuinely thought about it, in the way he thought about things that deserved a real answer, and told her that some things would be different, and some things would stay exactly the same. She had nodded as though this was a satisfying and complete answer, which told him that she was, already at 10 years old, a person who understood that the best truths are rarely simple. He had tucked her in that night, with the particular tenderness of a parent who has been reminded that everything he does for one reason, sleeping now in the next room with one sock off and her reading light still on. When he pulled up to the school that Tuesday morning, she gathered her things and kissed him on the cheek and climbed out of the car, and then she turned back and looked at him through the window with an expression that was too old for 10 and too true to ignore, and she said, "I always knew, Dad." He watched her walk through the school doors. He stayed parked at the curb for a moment after she disappeared inside, hands on the wheel, looking at the ordinary, unremarkable street of an ordinary Tuesday morning, and something that had lived in his chest for 7 years settled into a different arrangement, not gone, not forgotten, but no longer heavy. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't come with titles or credentials, or a platform from which to speak. It is the courage of the person who notices something true and says so, knowing that the consequences might be severe and saying it anyway, because the alternative is to carry the weight of deliberate silence, and that weight has its own cost, measured in years. Jack Turner had paid that cost once. He had paid it in full. What the morning of the coffee cup had shown, what it had forced a room full of powerful people to confront. is that integrity does not disappear when it goes unacknowledged. It waits. It continues to observe. It remembers. And when the moment finally arrives, it speaks with the kind of clarity that 7 years of patience gives you, clear and quiet, and entirely impossible to dismiss. The truth had been buried. It had been buried carefully and deliberately by people with access, resources, and every institutional advantage. And still, in the end, it found its way to the surface not through a formal investigation or a regulatory review or a whistleblower protection policy, but through the quiet, continuous attentiveness of one man who had never stopped knowing what he knew, and who, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, looked at a coffee cup and recognized that something was wrong, and chose to say so regardless of what it cost him. That is not a small thing. That is the thing everything else depended on.